as mentioned, Manu Gonzalez has extended his World Championship lead with the events of Hungary up to 25 points over the rider you just saw, Aaron Canet, who was the Moto2 winner the last time this class raced here, his final Grand Prix of 2024, the Solidarity Grand Prix. Given the World Championship battle that we're witnessing in 2025, if you want something to whet your appetite for what we may see this weekend in Moto2, the last Moto2 Grand Prix to be held here, the top three was Canet, Gonzalez, Moreira.
Yeah, current championship top three, your current championship battle as Lou Reed plays out with the PA. I can totally get behind that song selection at this stage on a Friday morning. Chapeau to whoever has got the iPad blaring. But you're absolutely right. It should be a bumper weekend of action here, and the Moto2 World Championship is really, really finely poised after, well, more than halfway stage. We've still got a decent number of races to go, 8 rounds to go in this World Championship, and well, I think it is wide open between Gonzalez, Canet and Moreira. 31 points covering the top three.
It feels like that gap is likely to close, certainly between Gonzalez and Moreira, if current form is any indication. Jake Dixon, who you saw there, well, his return to form probably came too late to keep him in the World Championship picture. Led a Grand Prix for the first time in quite some while back in Hungary with that stunning first lap where he passed Manu Gonzalez here on screen, amongst others, to take the lead of that Grand Prix. Gonzalez and Moreira perhaps with thoughts of each other. Dixon took full advantage, finished within a second of the race victory. Felt that it was such an unfamiliar feeling for him, so long since he led a Grand Prix that he didn't quite know what to do with himself when he actually took the lead of the Grand Prix. Manu Gonzalez there, and I think the Instagram post you were about to see was confirmation that he is staying exactly where he is for 2026. If he is the Moto2 World Champion once the dust settles in Valencia, then he will be defending that crown in 2026. Confirmation which was largely expected as soon as Jack Miller's place in the Pramac Yamaha MotoGP squad was rubber stamped for next season. Mere minutes after that, we have the confirmation that Gonzalez will remain an intact Moto2 rider for next season.
Yeah, much to the light of Jürgen Ligon, everyone down at the Impact GP squad. They were really hopeful that Manu would stick around for another year in 2026. More on that once the session gets up and running. But while he's on our screens, we may as well mention that rider there, Colin Bear, posting his best Moto2 result of the season, and his best performance over a weekend so far in Moto2. I think it's safe to say 5th on the grid, 5th in the race as well, less than 1 second off the podium. Colin Bear was in absolutely sensational form in Hungary, and like Alonso, I feel that kind of performance proves that he is very much a force now in this category after a tricky start to the year, which was injury afflicted, but the last 2 or 3 results, Bear has been knocking on the door.
Yeah, Nicky Ayo, his team manager, described it as his best Moto2 weekend so far. You could see that from the pure results, but it just looked it, didn't it, through the entire weekend. It wasn't as if he fluked his way to 5th on the grid. And qualifying was, in many respects, half of the battle back in Hungary. We saw from the very first free practice session on Friday morning at Balton Park, Colin Bear was a genuine top 6 contender. This man, by contrast, never really was on his first visit to Hungary. Barry Baltus, who's another rider who's probably drifting out of the World Championship battle now, 57 points behind Manu Gonzalez. It's not an unassailable gap. I feel he's going to have to go on quite a hot streak from here to bring himself back into contention in the 8 rounds that remain. Baltus paying the price pretty heavily for a poor qualifying down in 15th place, having had to go through qualifying 1, and his team manager Roberto Locatelli stressing that they need to be quicker and sharper with their strategy and their approach to qualifying and, of course, the Friday afternoon practice session, and put Baltus slightly further up the grid. He's qualified outside the top 10 in the last 2 now.
Baltus very much a victim of that lousy qualifying on the Saturday at the Balton Park. I meant to say, yeah, he was well down the grid in 15th, came through to 12th, and was a little frustrated by the fact that he was battling with some slightly slower riders and couldn't quite get past them. But tough weekend on the whole for Baltus, and slightly underwhelming Fantic racing as well, you could say. Really aside from a little spurt towards the end of FP2 on Saturday morning, then a decent qualifying for Aaron Canet. That aside, it was a tricky weekend overall for both Baltus and Canet. Looking to do something that, well, certainly Canet was able to do in the final race off last year. Looking here for the Solidarity GP. Baltus needs something like a miracle if he wants to get himself properly back into the title fight. From here with 8 rounds to go, 57 points in arrears. It's going to be a tall order for the Belgian. You do feel that now it is very much a three-way fight for the World Championship.
Into Friday, it was looking truly desperate, wasn't it, for the Frantic squad? They did turn things around slightly on the Saturday, but ultimately a weekend which fell short of their expectations. With Canet, as we'll come on to as we go through the session, really nearly the perfect setup. And it was quite a unique and quirky Barcelona Park circuit. Perhaps something a little bit more conventional this weekend with the circuit to Barcelona-Catalunya, which of course all the Moto2 teams know so well. Of course, tested here already earlier in the season. As we take a look at Darren Binder, who didn't enjoy his Barcelona Park experience. We gather, of course I was in the commentary box at the time, but we understood that Darren Binder, with the traffic problems getting into the circuit on the Sunday in Hungary, only actually arrived at the circuit around half an hour before the race was due to start. So tough it was getting to the circuit, and I think within 10 seconds of the Grand Prix getting underway, he probably wonders why he'd bothered.
Yeah, it was a short-lived experience for Darren. The race on Sunday was quite a hectic. We were stuck for about 50 minutes or so, and I've never seen a commentary partner look so frazzled around the edges as he did as we entered into the Barcelona Park circuit on that Sunday morning.
Breakfast window was fast closing now.
Most important day of Sunday, of course.
Fancy to track house for that.
Yeah, in danger of being missed, but thankfully we made that, and thankfully we made the action as well on the Sunday. That's a welcome returnee to the Moto2 class, the number 81 of Senna Agius, just leaving the intact GP box. He was missing in Hungary with Sergio Garcia deputising for him, but Senna has made a comeback after sustaining a bit of a concussion in that horrible crash back in Austria 3 weeks ago. And thankfully Senna passed fit yesterday and is feeling much better after a few days after that crash, when he was feeling a little dodgy, had some headaches, some clear signs of concussion, but thankfully those dissipated after 3 or 4 days, and he's back here in action around what has been a pretty good track for him in recent history.
Yeah, long lap penalty arguably cost him a podium here last season. That Grand Prix where, of course, we had long lap penalties playing a serious role in who won and who didn't, with Fermin Aldeguer leading the Grand Prix, getting a long lap penalty and then crashing whilst trying to serve it in our first visit here last year, and Senna Agius, who was in that battle for 3rd place, ultimately shuffled back a couple of spots with that trip through the long lap penalty. Look, here he is on the number 81. Of course, his place was taken by Sergio Garcia in Hungary. Garcia is busy himself this weekend as a World Superbike deputy over at Magny Core on a factory Honda. Of course, we now know Sergio Garcia is going to be a regular on this grid once again next season. And just to tidy up some of the other loose ends coming into this weekend, as Neil mentioned, Senna Agius is back. We are still awaiting the return of Dennis Unchu. The very able deputy of Danny Munoz steps in once again here this weekend for the Red Bull KTM IO squad, a European Moto2 winner around here, and you might recall qualified up in 7th place for this Grand Prix last year when he was on a wild card outing. And we do have one wild card here this weekend. It is a name that you might be already familiar with if you've been following Moto2 this season. It's the number 61 of Eric Fernandez, who's riding for Hector Faubel's FAU 55 squad on a Boscoscuro. His welcoming back present for racing this weekend is a long lap penalty, which he has to serve for taking out another wild card, Milan Pavelec, back at Brno. Penalty to be served in his next Grand Prix. That is this weekend. Fernandez, who is a Catalan, 18 years old, from Barcelona, gets an opportunity at his home Grand Prix. And we also welcome back a rider who is based in Barcelona, but of course hails from Indonesia. Mario Adji does make his long-awaited return from his well-documented shoulder dislocation issues this weekend at Honda Team Action.
We haven't seen him since the Spanish Grand Prix at Jerez. He withdrew from that with injury issues, so great to see the Indonesian back, as we have confirmation on our screens that Manuel Gonzalez will be staying with Intact GP for a further season in 2026. He'll be looking to become just the third rider to defend potentially a world championship in this category in history, after Tito Rabat and Johann Zarco. And well, it was a bit of a late play, we believe, from Yamaha, who were showing a bit of an interest around the time of the Austrian Grand Prix, and that obviously made the Intact GP squad a little nervous, thinking if they might have to find a replacement for Manu at a fairly advanced stage of the summer. But in the end, Yamaha decided to plump for Jack Miller, who will stay on in Pramac alongside Toprak Razgatlioglu next year. And you have to think that that does make sense, with the fact that they're going to be bringing their V4 engine to race next year. And Fabio Quartararo doesn't have any V4 experience. Alex Rins has half a year V4 experience on a Honda before he got seriously injured at Mugello back in 2023. Then you've got Toprak Razgatlioglu, who's got no V4 experience, so I think it does make sense to keep the Aussie, who obviously has ridden Hondas, Ducatis and KTMs in MotoGP in years gone by. And Manu Gonzalez staying put in a potentially championship winning squad, I don't think is a bad substitute either. We know he really was set on going up to MotoGP in 2026. I think he's done enough this year in Moto2 to earn a place in the Premier class, but it's a tough gig, especially in a year when most of the riders are already signed up for 2026, and a much better chance for Manu next year to sign for a MotoGP team in 2027. So certainly all is not lost. I think there'll be a little bit of disappointment that it never quite worked out, but yeah, staying to potentially defend your Moto2 crown is not a bad substitute.
Yeah, there's some nice words in the direction of Manu Gas from a previous Moto2 world champion, something that Manu is looking to achieve himself this season. Pedro Acosta in the pre-event press conference yesterday, of course the 2023 world champion, who says that Manu essentially continues to do what he's doing. His time will come in MotoGP. He's made such a quantum leap forward from last season to this. Of course, did become a Grand Prix winner in slightly unusual circumstances back in Japan last year, but has become in many respects become the reference. He's become the yardstick in Moto2 this season. I guess the only concern if you're Manu Gonzalez in terms of a MotoGP future, which of course will come in 2027 at the earliest now, is what scope is there now for Manu Gonzalez for a stock to go up? If he wins the World Championship this season, I guess there's only one direction his reputation and his stock can go from there, and that is down. He can maybe keep himself in the thoughts of MotoGP teams by retaining the Moto2 World Championship, as Johann Zarco did back in 2016 and earned his place on the MotoGP grid. But I guess Gonzalez's fear could be, in a year's time, perhaps the likes of David Alonso, who knows, maybe a Colin Vaya, maybe someone like that, maybe a Denis Onju, one of the younger, less established Moto2 runners, might suddenly become a more attractive pick over Manu Gonzalez, who, I guess by Moto2 terms, is no spring chicken. By the time we get into the heart of next season, he's already 23 years of age, so he'll be 24 if he does debut in MotoGP in 2027, which by our general terms is not old at all. But MotoGP teams are already looking at riders in their late teens and very, very early 20s for a potential MotoGP rookie.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's always a new face to pick up, who is probably going to be a little bit younger than that. You think of the likes of David Alonso, who I'm sure will be on the radar of many MotoGP factories for 2027. Maybe even the likes of, well, getting a bit ahead of myself here, but Jose Antonio Rueda, should he step up and make a bit of a mark on this class next year as Moto3 champion? I could foresee a situation where he could maybe be fast-tracked up to the Premier class as well. But yeah, Manu Gonzalez, what I like about him is that he's not really appeared as though he's held a grudge this year. I think there is maybe a little avenue for him to be or to feel slightly overlooked and overviewed, but on the whole I think he's just handled the situation quite well, and he's taken it in good grace. When he spoke about the situation after the Hungarian GP. He was by no means bitter or negative about the situation. He said, "I'm in a great team, I love this team, and I think it's a really good place to be." So there wasn't a sense of kind of anguish from his part that he was going to have to stick around in this category for another year.
He's only won one of the last 8 Grand Prix now, believe it or not, is Manu Gonzalez. And I say believe it or not because it doesn't really feel like it, does it? Because he's remained the reference. I think most people would still say he's the fastest rider in Moto2 these days. So often we see him go out Friday morning, first free practice session of the weekend, and immediately put a marker down and establish himself as the rider to beat on that given weekend. But for various reasons, and there have been many of them in those 8 Grand Prix, it just hasn't quite come together for Gonzalez. Of course, crashed trying to come back through the field from a poor start at Silverstone, crashed in qualifying in Aragon, won despite the grid penalty in Mugello. Of course, had those early grip problems in Assen when we expected him to win that Grand Prix. Stunning recovery from deep on the grid in the Sachsenring, and ultimately in Brno there were stronger riders on the racetrack. Here's one of them in the form of Joe Roberts. Of course, he was very unlucky with the stone through his radiator in Austria and was half a lap away from winning the Hungarian Grand Prix a couple of weeks ago. So you can't exactly say that Gonzalez has, I guess, peaked in this Moto2 season or gone through any sort of dip. It's just not quite. Cars just haven't quite fallen in his favour over the last 7 or 8 Grand Prix by and large, but he keeps putting himself in the right position. And one thing that was quite interesting that he pointed out from the Hungarian Grand Prix is that it was such a difficult Grand Prix to be leading in, because it was a race dictated by hitting your braking markers, just trying to get yourself stopped as best as you can for those many tight chicanes. And as Manu pointed out, that was so much easier to do when you had a rider immediately ahead of you.
Yeah, absolutely, and he did lead the majority of that race. Well, he sat behind Jake Dixon at first, and then Diogo Moreira made his play late on, but in the end just had absolutely nothing. We still haven't actually seen the victor from 2 weeks ago, David Alonso, on our screens just yet, but he is out there making steady progress his first trip to this track with Moto2 machine as he just comes across the line behind this main group. You can see that peak number 80 just behind there. Bright blue bike coming into view down in towards turn 1, but did get a little bit unlucky in that last lap fight as well when Alonso passed him, pushed a little bit wide, and Diogo Moreira was very opportunistic and dived through as well. And I mean, that last lap was absolutely sensational, wasn't it? Because it looked as though Alonso had wrapped it up after he took the lead from Manu Gonzalez. Really done the hard work, and then coming into that last chicane, completely got his braking marker wrong, and had to set the bike up mid-chicane to avoid Diogo Moreira gunning it under him into the final turn. So it was a dramatic turn of events.
I thought I performed the most almighty of commentators' curses on David Alonso, because I was saying all those nice things about him on that final lap, and he then proceeded to overshoot the final chicane. And of course, what's crucial about that final chicane is that he had to go around the corner as slow as it was going to be, because had he shortcutted the final chicane, he would have essentially been given a 1-second penalty, and it would have dropped him behind both Moreira and Gonzalez anyway. So he had to keep it on the racetrack, even if that was going to put him under some serious pressure into the final quarter. He was just about able to get it to the apex of the left, the second part of the chicane, just park it there and stop Moreira and Gonzalez from going past him, and allow David Alonso to take a maiden Moto2 victory. He said he was in a bubble during that Grand Prix. He said he had no idea how many laps were left until there were 3 to go, and then when there was 1 to go, he was just focusing on the rider ahead of him, just taking each overtake as it came. And of course there were several overtakes to be made after that poor start, down in 11th place on the grid. And I guess you can't really say, Neil, that David Alonso has overcome the clear deficiencies he still has in Moto2. He said himself, he says, I need to figure out how to get these bikes off the line. I just can't get these Moto2 bikes off the line. I'm qualifying poorly because I can't exploit new tyres. I'm then dropping places on the first lap, and I'm always having to launch a comeback mission in the Grand Prix itself. And boy, did he do that in the Hungarian Grand Prix. But clearly still some areas for Alonso to work on, and once he's fixed those, Moto2's in a great deal of trouble.
Yeah, if he's winning races from being somewhere down outside the top 10 on the first lap, then can you imagine what it will be like when he's nailing his starts from pole position? I think everyone will be in for a fairly hard time, not just next year, but perhaps even in the final 5 or 6 races of this year. David was saying after the race in Hungary that just his physical size is a bit of a hindrance for him getting the bike off the line, because it is obviously a lot bigger physically. He said he's trying his best to stay over the front of the bike to kind of limit the wheelie, but just can't really manage to do that with his quite small and slight frame. He said whatever that he's trying, still manages to get a big amount of air under his front wheel just off the line. And he said Aspar and his team are still trying to work on some different strategies to make sure his launch control setting is absolutely correct. He feels that there's some work to be done just there as well. But yeah, once they figure that out, it is going to be very interesting to see just what kind of results he can put together, because it was an astonishing ride. And you know, for a rider to have won his first ever Grand Prix in similarly dramatic fashion, coming from what, 28th on the grid to first, I mean, he is the king of comebacks, David Alonso, and I never like to make these comparisons, but it was a little Marc Marquez-esque in just how he was able to kind of swat aside riders in front of him quite effortlessly as he came from back to front. And what I liked about his race in Hungary is that he clearly had learned the lesson from the previous week in Austria. He said in Austria he was constantly looking at the leader, who was Diogo Moreira. He was in third, Moreira was in first. He said anytime Moreira got a bit of an advantage, it started to make him just a little bit nervous, and ultimately that is what led to his downfall. Whereas he said 1 week on in Hungary, he just had his eyes on the rider directly in front of him, and he thought, well, let's just see if I can get a bit closer to third, pass him, who was I think Jake Dixon at the time. Okay, I passed him. Let's see if I can get close to Moreira. He did, passed him, and then suddenly he had just the leader ahead of him. So you know this kid is not just very fast, but also intelligent and very thorough in how he prepares for his racing, and that was very much in evidence again in Hungary just 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, he's clearly got a real trump card already in Moto2 in how strong he is on worn tyres. Late in the race, and that could potentially be a real advantage for him. Days in general, but dark days for a rider who's just so used to winning.
Yeah, and that has been a new challenge for him. There is no question about it. He's had to completely adapt to a new situation after he became so accustomed to fighting at the front and winning 14 victories last year. Still a record for a number of successes over a single Grand Prix campaign. I feel like that is probably going to come under some stress, that record, in the next couple of weeks from a certain Marc Marquez in the Premier class. But yeah, to go from that situation to what he's experienced must be quite tough, must have been quite tough. but he has come out the other side. And I think you could say, looking at his results, that after his podium at Silverstone, there's been there was a bit of a drop-off in performance. But I'm inclined to think that you look a little bit deeper, the potential in there most weekends, maybe not for victories, but certainly for top 6 finishes, maybe even for podiums. You mentioned the fact he was taken out of the race at Aragon by this rider here on our screens, Dani Holgado. I think Alonso was on for a decent result that day, maybe a podium challenge. He had really good rhythm in the Sachsenring, but then qualified down in 17th, and obviously had that huge collision with Diogo Moreira, as you mentioned as well, Lewis. He had really good speed in Brno, but qualified down in 20th, mounted a pretty good comeback to finish 10th, and then obviously was sat very pretty in Austria, potentially had victory within his grasp before he crashed out with just a couple of laps to go when sat in 3rd. So yeah, the results maybe don't show it, but I'm inclined to think that that result was coming, and it had been coming for a couple of weeks with Alonso. Hungary, he was just able to put everything together, whereas in the previous weeks he had faltered and struggled with that somewhat.
It does beg the question, as we've already sort of posed it, just what kind of threat could he be, not just for next season in Moto2, but in the latter part of this season with some of the Grand Prix that we still have to go to. Of course, Misano to come. Next weekend, of course, all the circuits I'm about to tell you about are circuits that he won at last season, with the exception of Portimao, which of course moves from the beginning of last year to the end of this. Of course, Teki to come in a couple of Grand Prix time, where he won the Moto3 World Championship last season. Delica, another victorious venue for Alonso last season. Phillip Island, of course, which we're all looking forward to in mid-October. Sepang and the return to the Iberian Peninsula for the final 2 Grand Prix of the season, Portimao, and of course a return to Valencia after the tragic events of late last year, which prevented us from visiting that part of Spain, and of course left the World Championship to be concluded here at the Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya. We'll follow Alonso here through the final part of this lap, because this looks set to move him somewhere up the order. He's completed turn 10 and 11, and you're now turning right for the remainder of the circuit. This is turn 12, and the final couple of corners, both around 140 kilometres an hour in 2nd gear. 13 has been completed. Keep yourself off the green now as you approach 14, the final corner of this Catalunya circuit. David Alonso, he's aiming at a 1:43.1, which is current fastest time for Manu Gonzalez. It's a 44.1 for David Alonso, losing a huge chunk of time in that final sector. It is Manu Gonzalez then, in his customary free practice 1 position of first. Jake Dixon, of course, a former winner himself here in Barcelona, 2nd. From Diogo Moreira, Dani Holgado and Ethan Guevara. So it's Boscoscuro's 2nd, 5th and 7th at the moment. Of course, with a Grand Prix circuit that they dominated on our first of 2 visits here last year.
Yeah, it should have been a Boscoscuro 1-2-3 in that first race, but for Camino de Gau's Rain Park on at the long lap penalty lane at turn 1, when he crashed out of victory contention. Gura eventually coming through and taking his first victory of 2024. Eventually a victorious campaign, but yeah, Gura won that day from Sergio Garcia in 2nd, and a lot of the talk yesterday amongst the MotoGP riders was just how low the grip conditions here are at the Circuit Barcelona-Catalunya. Even back to previous tracks we visited this year with similar levels of low grip, you would have to really make the comparison of Argentina, and 1 and 2 in Argentina was Jake Dixon and Manu Gonzalez, currently 1 and 2 in this session, albeit in the reverse order. So keep your eye on Dixon this weekend. Could be an interesting time for him. Dixon has a fantastic record at this circuit as well. Victor here 2 years ago in 2023 in that brilliant last lap fly with Aaron Canet, with Pedro Acosta as well. He was on the podium here in the first of the 2 races in 2024, so Dixon certainly likes this track. We know his chassis likes this track, and it has shown already this year that it works in pretty low grip conditions. So keep your eye on number 96, who really came back from the brink, didn't he, in Hungary after such a disastrous weekend in Austria. write Jake Dixon off at your peril. Just when it looks as though he's down and out, he does manage to make a bit of a comeback with, qualifying fourth and a brilliant fourth place in the race. No one was expecting, I think, Jake to be leading those early laps.
No, least of all Jake, who, as mentioned, said he, in his words, felt a bit out of sorts when he was at the front of the Grand Prix. So wasn't expecting to be here. Of course, recovering from what was certainly down there was one of his worst Moto2 weekends in Austria, where he failed to make it into qualifying 2, which is a rarity in the Moto2 career of Jake Dixon, and ran into or was involved in a collision with Joe Roberts on the opening lap, which forced him to finish exactly where he started, but down in P20, which needed return to form for him. It remains likely that he's into the closing Grand Prix of his Moto2 career, with persistent reports that he's in the direction of World Superbikes for next season. Of course, Aaron Canet already confirmed that the Marc VDS squad for next season in Moto2. Jake Dixon, one of potentially 2 riders, we'll have to wait and see, potentially departing that squad.
Yeah, it does seem like we're going to have a completely new rider roster in the Marc VDS team next year. Aaron Canet has already been confirmed as possibly Jake Dixon's replacement. We're still waiting to see the identity of rider number 2, but Philip Salach has been told that he is out of a ride. He's apparently on the shopping list of Prama and their Moto2 racing team. Tony Arbolino will be departing there next year. There were 1 or 2 rumours linking Denise Onju to that second seat, but that I don't think is going to happen. So Philip Salach is a potential mover across from one Boscoscuro team to another next year. And speaking of Boscoscuros, here is Celestino Vietti. Absolute disaster was how he described this weekend in Hungary, and who am I to disagree?
Putting it. Yeah, it was an absolute nightmare, wasn't it, for Celestino Vietti. It was his worst qualifying since Aragon 2021, best part of 4 years ago. But already this weekend is looking a little bit better for Chile. Only number 13 as the Speed RS Boscoscuro goes orange for this weekend. A Beta Tools sponsorship. 1:42.729 for Vietti is within a second of the all-time lap record of Sergio Garcia, which he set last year. 1:41.894 is the fastest ever Moto2 lap around here. Of course, we speak of Jake Dixon as a former Moto2 winner around this place. Of course, Celestino Vietti is the same.
He is indeed. Back in 2022.
One of the great Moto2 battles here.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, we've had quite a few, to be fair, in the last handful of years. The 2022 race was absolutely epic, with Vietti, Aaron Canet, Augusto Fernandez and Jake Dixon all vying for victory in the closing laps. And then the following year we had something of an epic as well, when Dixon went head-to-head with Aaron Canet and Albert Arenas, of all people. So keep an eye on the race on Sunday. Moto2 really has delivered in 2025. I think it's been the best of all the Grand Prix categories for just pure, exciting and unpredictable racing across the year. We've already had 8 different winners from 14 races. Alonso being the 8th different one. And looking at some of the results, some of the names that haven't won yet, this rider included, you would have to say that number could still climb before the season is out in Valencia in mid-November. So it's not just the quality of the racing in Moto2 that has shown this year. I think it's been the variety that we've also seen in the class as well.
Yeah, looking at the World Championship at the moment, of course, we've got Barry Baltas 4th in the World Championship, yet to win. You feel if he continues to operate at the level he has this season, his time may still come for this year. Vietti, as you mentioned, who's 6th in the points. Albert Arenas 8th in the World Championship. Probably with a victory at some stage in the final round of this season could be a good time for him as he looks to secure a place on the Moto2 grid for next season. And there's a couple of other rookies who you couldn't rule out. Danny Holgado, who's had a good start to this session. Perhaps he might find himself in race-winning contention late in the year. Of course, chased Diogo Moreira much of the way in Austria for race victory. And Holgado currently up in 5th place in this session at 1:43.203. He is currently your top rookie in this first free practice session here in Barcelona.
I wonder whether Holgado's pride was stung slightly by the fact that his fellow rookie teammate managed to win his first Moto2 race before he did. Holgado is by no means a disaster for the current Moto3 runner-up from last year. In Hungary, he was 9th at the end of play, which was a decent result considering he had a really tough start, a tough first lap. Was back, I think, in 13th at one point on lap 1, so coming through to 9th was a decent effort for Danny, but after the heights that he had hit in the previous 2 Grand Prix in Brno in Austria, it was something of a deflated Danny Holgado that spoke after the race. I think his teammate's success played a small part in that as well, but he has come out guns blazing here so far. Holgado currently 5th, just 4 tenths per second off this rider here, chasing up Yeti. What is it about Yeti now? He's showing his hand on a Friday morning. We've seen this a couple of times. Normally he's been a slow starter when you see the best of Celestino in Sunday's race. We spoke back at that 2022 race weekend. I seem to recall Yeti managing to come through by the skin of his teeth into Q2, and we thought, well, he's just about made it in, and then suddenly he put it on the front row and then was up dicing for victory and ended up winning the race after a completely anonymous Friday. Only really salvaged his weekend on the Saturday morning and went on to win the race. So we've seen a bit of a reversal of that so far with his 42.7 topping this session so far, although that is in some danger. Philip Salac goes faster still, 42.5, so a real decent early run here from the Boscoscuro riders.
Yeah, and you do wonder whether the characteristics of this circuit might well play into Boscoscuro's hands. We generally have seen this season, perhaps when grip levels have been high, the Boscoscuros do run into some chatter problems and perhaps chew up their tyres a little bit too quickly in the Grand Prix. I don't think too much grip is going to be a problem this weekend around the circuit of Barcelona-Catalunya. It is a notoriously abrasive racetrack, and we also don't have the absolute softest specification of tyres for that reason, really. We have the SC0 and the development E125 softer tyre. The SCX, which we have seen on previous occasions this season, was never really going to be an option around a circuit such as this one, which could potentially also play into the hands of the Boscoscuro contingent. Although it's not exactly unheard of this season to see Boscoscuro strong early on in a Grand Prix weekend. Once the track rubbers in and that grip level does start to move upwards, the Boscoscuros tend to move downwards.
Yeah, we have seen that a couple of times. In 2025, the likes of Tony Arbolino starting the weekend very well and then not really able to improve from there. Good lap time there from the Australian Senna Ages, jumping back up here and showing that he's not really carrying too many scars after that nasty crash when he was run over by Alonso Lopez on the first lap of the Austrian Grand Prix. And there is something of a landmark potentially in store for Calix here this weekend. The German chassis manufacturer on course to win its 200th race in the Moto2 category since it first started competing in this class in its first year in 2010. So Calix well on their way to winning another Constructors' Championship this year. And they could seal their 200th ever Grand Prix victory here this weekend.
Yeah, the Constructors' Championship will have to wait at least for another Grand Prix weekend. Their advantage over Boscoscuro stands at 143 points. They're a good 100 points or so short of being able to wrap that up here. Of course, the MotoGP and Moto3 Constructors' crowns could be all sewn up this weekend, and in the case of MotoGP, almost certainly will. Ducati can wrap them up as early as tomorrow in the Tissot Sprint, as Barry Baltus now takes second place, splits the Boscoscuros up at the top. As Albert Arenas now heads to the top, the 75 on the Grassini bike, blue and red, making its way towards us, and turn 1 on 1:42.500 for Albert Arenas, who of course to take famously his first Moto2 podium right here.
Been a good track for Arenas in years gone by. You can see all sorts of riders are putting red sectors in. Danny Holgado, Ethan Guevara, Aaron Canet, and Albert Arenas all among them. Let's see what Guevara can do as he guns it out of the final turn. Former victor here in Moto3 is Ethan Guevara, and he will have been more than delighted to have had 10 days days to rest up after the Hungarian race. Bruce Karen mystery hand injury after the Austrian Grand Prix. Poor Ethan had a bit of an ordeal, didn't he, on the Sunday in Hungary. He jumped the start. He actually got a decent start. He felt he didn't gain any ground.
No.
There was a little bit of movement from him just before the lights went out. He was then handed a double long lap penalty, and he made a mess of one of those long laps, which meant he was given a third. And at that point he said, you know what, considering the amount of pain that I'm feeling in my hands, I think it's probably time just to call it quits and rest up. So he was seventh after the first two turns. He was adamant that it was nothing to do with his jump start.
It was all turn one.
Yeah, it was all turn one, Your Honour.
Yeah,
I'm sure he made
not
that.
guilty.
I'm sure he made that argument to the FIM stewards, but there was definitely movement before the lights went out. So Ethan Guevara, unfortunately, a non-score and a retirement in Hungary.
Yeah, sadly, when Simon Crafar flicks through the rule book, there is nothing in there that says, oh, you didn't gain an advantage, we'll let you off. Because otherwise everyone will be trying that in the Grand Prix to come. And it's the second time, of course, this year that Ethan, unfortunately, has jumped the start. I recall all the way back at the first Grand Prix in Thailand, he jumped the start when, again, he looked pretty competitive in those early stages. It's now Danny Holgado to the top of this session as perhaps some new tyres get thrown at it. In these final 5 minutes, we're down to a 42.3 now for Holgado. Baltas, Arenas, Canet and Guevara. Salac has been shuffled back to 6th place now, as Guevara sets another mid to high 142. Gonzalez then, who were keeping tabs on at the bottom of the screens, has been shuffled back to 12th place now in this session. He's now quickly rocketed back up into 3rd place. Diogo Moreira has been relegated down to 13th place. And Aaron Canet, the third of our three title contenders, not in terms of championship position, but third in the order that I've mentioned them. He's currently in 5th place and currently going quickly through sector 2.
Yeah, he didn't just win here last year, but as we mentioned, has been in victory contention more often than not as Canet. Very, very close to victory in both 22 and 23 here, so expect him to go very well this weekend. I guess there's two ways to look at Canet's performance in Hungary, Lewis. On the one hand, he kind of rescued a weekend which was looking pretty disastrous, like it had the potential to be disastrous on the Friday. A solid top 6 finish. But on the other hand, we're 14 races into 2025, and Aaron Canet is still saying we've yet to find our ideal setup for this year. I mean, surely it's getting to the point where you're thinking it's not going to come.
Yeah, if you haven't found it by now, what else is there to try? It's some shades of Pecco Bagnaia or MotoGP, isn't it? Although he feels he might have found the magic silver bullet last time out in Hungary. We'll perhaps get answers on that one later on in the weekend. And exactly what you said there is kind of part of the problem for Aaron Canet. It feels like every Grand Prix weekend we go to, Canet's rescuing weekends, he's salvaging podiums, he's doing a very good job of staying consistent and keeping himself in the World Championship battle. 25 points, the gap to Manu Gonzalez. But is there any Grand Prix weekend really in Moto2 this season where you can say truly Aaron Canet has been the fastest rider at all times through the weekend? You can certainly say it about this man, Manu Gonzalez. You can say it, I guess, about Diogo Moreira too. I think Austria underlined that he's a rider who can lead from the front and not just follow. And it says a lot about Aaron Canet and his pedigree in Moto2. The fact he's second in the World Championship, I'm almost looking at him as the outsider in this three-way title battle.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting point. You could maybe make the argument that prior to his big crash in Austria, he was showing, arguably for the first time this year, the pace and the potential to beat the #1 dog in this Moto2 race, but obviously had that big crash and then was walking wounded afterward. But yeah, the last couple of weekends, you do have the impression that he's just been doing enough to limit the damage to Manu Gonzalez in the title fight. And let's be frank, had Manu Gonzalez had some better luck, had a stone not gone through his radiator in Austria, he would be looking at potentially a 50-point championship advantage with 8 races to play, which would not quite be insurmountable, but would be approaching that level for sure. Canet still very much in the fight, and it was interesting speaking to Manu Gonzalez after the race in Hungary. He had just been beaten by Diogo Moreira. Moreira is in fantastic form, arguably the form rider in Moto2 at the moment. And he was asked, how are you viewing the championship fight? Is Diogo, even if he's third in the championship, is he the rider that you have your eye on more than Aaron Canet? And kind of inconsistent, in a consistent way that he's been speaking of Diogo Moreira over the last couple of months. He was somewhat dismissive of the Brazilian. Manu Gonzalez was like, nah, I think Aaron Canet is the rider I'm still looking at. And he was making a very valid point that over the last couple of years in the flyaways, Canet has generally been pretty strong. So he thinks that once we go to the likes of Motegi, Mandalika Streak Circuit in Indonesia, Phillip Island and Sepang, that is when Canet will properly come into his own. But remains to be seen if he hasn't managed to find that winning magic formula that has been missing in the first 14 races. Who's to say that it will come in these final 8?
I kind of feel like he's sort of banking on it at this stage. Is the 44. Certainly one thing you can say about Aaron Canet is if you back him into a corner, he's going to come back out fighting. No questions about that. And once again, sounding out his customary pre-weekend rallying cry on social media. Aaron Canet's Instagram post at the end of yesterday when he ran the circuit, he says, "Evolve without asking for forgiveness. Hunger isn't a flaw, it's an advantage." I'm going to say that to myself when I go for my second lunch visit this afternoon. Hunger is not a flaw, it's an advantage now.
Yeah, and we're queuing up for our ice creams after lunch. That'll be the motto. I think I might hang that in the commentary booth just to keep us going through this weekend. A busy weekend, of course. We have the Moto2 World Championship here as well this weekend and next in Misano, so a full schedule coming up of racing and potentially a pivotal weekend in Moto2 and in MotoGP as well. Because be able to go to the next round in Misano, potential match point, first match point of the year. That is one of the big talking points, as well as we see the checkered flag out. Danny Holgado currently topping this session. It looks as though his 142.3 will not be topped, but a solid session there for Manu Gonzalez. And Jake Dixon started the session very well, but ended up down in 13th. He's just crossed the line, jumped up 2 positions.
That was his work all done on a single set of tyres in this session. Jake Dixon, he was only 4.5 tenths away from the pace, but as we always say in Moto2, there's an awful lot of riders that you can cram into a gap of that sort of margin. Take Celestino Vietti, for instance, who was top of this session by the thick end of 4 tenths around 10 minutes ago. He's going to end the morning down in 12th. As Danny Munoz takes the checkered flag, he's going to end it inside the top 10, 9th place for him, and strong reports that Danny Munoz finally, after his place at the Precanos team quite obviously fell through coming to this season, it does look as if his place as a Moto2 regular is secure for next season.
Yeah, some strong rumours linking him to a seat at Italtrans next year to replace the outgoing Diogo Moreira. I think there were quite a few names on the shopping list of Livio Suppo down at Italtrans, but 1 or 2 didn't quite go his way, so it looks as though they'll be plumping for Danny Munoz, who I think has proven in his replacement rides and wildcard appearances in this Moto2 category that he is deserving of a full-time spot in 2026. But another rider very much deserving of a full-time slot is Danny Holgado, another Danny who has been mightily impressive here. A 42.3 was enough to top this first Moto2 session off the weekend by 0.14. Barry Baltus, and it was exceptionally tight at the top. His teammate David Alonso down in 14th, yet just over half a second off Danny. So I think we're going to have another very competitive weekend here. Barry Baltus certainly looks as though he is in the mood to get amongst it. There are 1 or 2 results that haven't quite lived up to his previous potential. Baltus starting the weekend strong here in Barcelona as well.
Number 7 in 2nd place, 42.4 for him. The Fantic squad 2nd, 5th in this morning session for them. Fantic, of course, do lead the team's championship in Moto2. Of course, this is the man that leads the Riders' Championship and will lead the World Championship out of this weekend, whatever happens. Manu Gonzalez will go to Misano as the Moto2 World Championship leader, even if he scores nothing here this weekend, and Aaron Canet goes on to win the race. Gonzalez takes the tiebreaker of most victories. What was he up to? What was his teammate up to? More to the point, around the final corner. This is Senna Agius lighting up the rear tyre through the final corner. Agius, of course, hot on the heels of an injury-enforced absence. Just about avoided another one there. So in the end, less than a second covered your top 18 in that morning free practice one session, all the way down to Ivan October in 18th place. Some high-profile names outside that, though. Tony Arbolino back in 19th, and Joe Roberts down in 24th, looking for more later today. Danny Holgado, though, your fastest rider in FP1. 42.3 season, a 10th clear of Barry Baltus. Manny Gonzalez, the chance to be the third from Albert Arenas and Aaron Canet. Ethan Cavara, 6th, leading Bosco Scuro from Philip Salax, Colin Vaya and Danny Munoz. Good morning, that for the IO squad. Alonso Lopez for Speed RS 10th, Agius 11th after that late drama ahead of early session leader Celestino Vietti. Jake Dixon, a former winner here, 13th from the informed David Alonso, and Zonta van den Gorberg, front row starter last time in Hungary and front row starter last time he came here at the end of last season. Jorge Navarro, after his crash at turn 1, slips back to 20th place. His teammate Alex Escridge on the second of the forward bikes was 25th. First Moto2 session of the weekend in the books, topped by Danny Holgado. We'll turn our attention to MotoGP in just a moment. Their free practice one session is moments away.
After a first visit to Balaton Park in Hungary, MotoGP is Barcelona bound for round 15 in the Monster Energy Grand Prix of Catalonia. With the flyaways fast approaching, Marc Marquez is fast approaching a 7th MotoGP title, which he could get a first match point for in Misano next weekend. FP1 fires up the Catalan clash next live. It's time for MotoGP. So the circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya, about a half an hour's drive from the beautiful city of Barcelona. 4.6 kilometres in length, 2.89 miles. Of course, we were here twice in 2024, eventually for our title decider in the Solidarity GP last November. Won, of course, then by Jorge Martin. It's another Spaniard that's looking to take another giant leap towards glory in 2025 here this weekend. That's Marc Marquez. Around this circuit, Barcelona-Catalunya. Our first visit here all the way back in 1992. Good morning and welcome to our coverage